Easter morning, 1945. The American POW camp sat quiet under a gray sky. Inside the mess hall, 400 German prisoners waited in silence, unsure what this day would bring. Among them, 3 women, former guards and soldiers who had been told Americans were savage beasts who tortured their captives. For weeks, they had been fed clean food, given medical care, treated with a dignity they never expected. It made no sense. The propaganda had promised brutality. Instead, they found restraint. Then Colonel Patterson, the camp commander, stood before the long tables laden with ham, potatoes, and vegetables. More food than they had seen in years. His words cut through the silence like a blade through their assumptions. Everyone eats today. It's Easter. 23-year-old Greta Muller, who had once denied food to starving prisoners at Ravensbrück, collapsed into tears. The concept of inclusive mercy shattered everything she thought she knew about her captors and herself. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. These stories of unexpected humanity cross all borders. The concrete cell smelled of disinfectant and fear. For 3 days, Greta Muller had sat on the narrow cot, her spine rigid against the wall, counting the footsteps that passed her door. 23 years old, trained to enforce discipline through violence, she maintained the posture of authority even in captivity. Her blonde hair, once pinned in regulation style, now hung limp around her shoulders, but she refused to slouch. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were savage beasts who would rape, torture, and execute German prisoners. She had prepared herself for screams, for brutality, for the kind of treatment she had once administered at Ravensbrück. Instead, the silence terrified her more than any torture could have. When the footsteps stopped outside her cell, Greta's hands clenched into fists. The key turned, and a young woman in an American Army uniform entered, carrying a metal tray. Lieutenant Sarah Cohen moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to treating wounded soldiers, but her dark eyes held a wariness that matched Greta's own. "Essen," Sarah said in careful German, setting the tray on the small table. Food, real food. Steam rose from a bowl of soup, and beside it lay bread that looked almost white. Not the gray sawdust mixture they had eaten during the final months of the war. Greta stared at the tray, then at the American nurse. Sarah's parents had fled Germany in 1938, though Greta had no way of knowing this. She saw only an enemy who spoke her language with a slight accent, who brought food instead of pain. "Warum?" Greta whispered. "Why?" Sarah paused at the door, her grip tightening on her medical bag. "Because you're human," she said simply, then left before Greta could respond. The soup was warm. Real vegetables floated in the broth, not the thin water they had called soup in the camps. Greta ate slowly, mechanically, her mind refusing to process the kindness. It had to be manipulation, a softening technique before the real interrogation began. Yet when she finished, no one came to demand information. The cell remained quiet. Easter morning arrived gray and overcast. Greta woke to the sound of keys jingling in the corridor, multiple doors opening and closing. She had barely slept, expecting execution at dawn. Instead, 2 American soldiers appeared at her door, their rifles held casually rather than aimed. "Time to go," one said in broken German. They escorted her through corridors she had never seen, past other cells where she glimpsed 2 familiar faces. Anna Richter, the young Wehrmacht radio operator with nervous hands, looked even smaller in her oversized prison uniform. Käthe Weber, the administrative clerk who had processed deportation papers with meticulous precision, walked with her usual measured steps, though her face had gone pale. The 3 women had never spoken during their brief time in the holding facility, but now they found themselves together in the back of an American truck, surrounded by guards who seemed more bored than threatening. Anna fidgeted with the hem of her uniform. Käthe stared straight ahead. Greta maintained her rigid posture, though her stomach churned with uncertainty. The truck drove for an hour through countryside that looked remarkably undamaged by war. Fields showed the first green of spring, and farmhouses stood intact, their windows unbroken. This was not the devastated wasteland they had been told to expect from Allied bombing. The contradiction gnawed at Greta's carefully constructed worldview. When they arrived at the larger POW camp, Greta's breath caught in her throat. Clean wooden barracks stretched in orderly rows. Laundry hung on lines between buildings, and she could see men in German uniforms working in vegetable gardens, moving freely without chains or guards constantly watching. 400 German prisoners, Anna had whispered during the ride, and they were alive, healthy, writing letters home. The camp commander waited to greet them personally. Colonel James Patterson stood tall and lean, his graying hair combed neatly, his uniform pressed despite the early hour. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to Sunday sermons rather than military orders. "Welcome to Camp Harrison," he said in careful German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention and with the dignity that befits human beings created in God's image." Greta wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Dignity? She had stripped that from countless prisoners, had watched them reduced to animals fighting over scraps. Yet something in Patterson's steady gaze prevented mockery. He meant what he said. They were assigned to a separate barracks for female prisoners, clean and sparse but warmer than the concrete cell. Anna immediately began arranging her few possessions with nervous energy. Kata methodically examined every corner, cataloging details with the same precision she had once applied to deportation lists. Greta simply sat on her cot, staring out the small window at German prisoners playing cards in the sunshine. The mess hall overwhelmed her senses. The building itself was larger than any dining facility she had ever seen, with long wooden tables that could seat hundreds. American soldiers served food from steaming pans, ladling generous portions onto metal trays. The smell of roasting meat made her mouth water involuntarily, but it was Patterson's announcement that broke her. Standing before the assembled prisoners, German and American personnel alike, he spoke with quiet authority that filled the large room. "Today is Easter," he said, his German pronunciation careful but clear. "A day when we remember that mercy triumphs over judgment, that love conquers death. Everyone eats today. Everyone." The words hit Greta like a physical blow. Everyone eats. For 2 years at Ravensbrück, she had decided who ate and who starved. She had held life and death in her hands, had used hunger as a weapon more effective than any rifle. The memory of skeletal hands reaching desperately for crusts of bread flashed through her mind. Ham, real ham, appeared on her plate. Potatoes with butter. Vegetables she had forgotten existed. Around her, German prisoners ate with quiet dignity, some weeping silently, others staring at their plates in disbelief. American soldiers sat at the same tables, sharing conversation in broken German and English. When the first bite of meat touched her tongue, Greta's carefully maintained composure shattered. Tears came in great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Anna reached across the table, her own eyes wet, and touched Greta's hand with surprising gentleness. Even Kata looked up from her methodical eating, something almost like compassion flickering in her expression. Colonel Patterson watched from across the room, his weathered face reflecting both satisfaction and sorrow. He had seen this reaction before, the moment when enemy soldiers realized they were being treated as human beings rather than monsters. It never failed to humble him. The propaganda had lied about everything. The Easter feast stretched into the afternoon, transforming the mess hall into something Greta had never witnessed in 2 years of war. German prisoners lingered at tables, engaging in conversations she had forgotten were possible. Laughter, actual laughter, echoed off the wooden walls as someone told a story about his hometown bakery. An older man with calloused hands carved wooden animals for younger prisoners, his weathered face peaceful in concentration. Lieutenant Sarah Cohen moved between the tables, checking on prisoners with practiced medical efficiency. Her stethoscope hung around her neck like a badge of purpose. And she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had saved lives under fire. When she paused near their table, Greta instinctively straightened, expecting interrogation or accusation. Instead, Sarah simply asked in careful German if anyone needed medical attention. Anna raised her hand hesitantly. My shoulder, she said, rotating her arm with visible discomfort. From the radio equipment. It's been stiff for months. Sarah's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern. I can look at that after the meal. Physical therapy might help. She glanced at Greta, whose medical training was invisible beneath her guard's uniform. Were you injured during capture? No, Greta replied, then added quietly, I was trained as a nurse. Before. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Sarah's dark eyes studied Greta's face, searching for deception or manipulation, finding only exhaustion and confusion. Perhaps you could help in the infirmary, Sarah said finally. We have many patients and German-speaking medical staff would be valuable. The offer struck Greta as incomprehensible. They wanted her to heal instead of harm, to use her hands for mercy rather than punishment. She nodded mutely, unsure of her own voice. Professor Wilhelm Hartmann appeared at their table as if summoned by Providence itself. The 58-year-old philosophy professor moved with academic dignity despite his prisoner's uniform, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp with intelligence that no war could diminish. He had been watching the women since their arrival, recognizing the particular devastation of those who had served the regime directly. May I join you? He asked with old-world courtesy, already pulling out a chair. I find Easter conversations more meaningful when shared with fellow pilgrims. Keta looked up from her methodical eating, her administrative mind immediately cataloging this new variable. Anna smiled shyly, grateful for any kindness. Greta remained silent, though something in the professor's gentle authority reminded her of her grandfather, a village doctor who had died before the war changed everything. You carry heavy burdens, Hartmann observed without judgment. I can see it in your faces, the weight of knowledge that contradicts everything we were taught to believe. The Americans, Anna whispered, glancing around nervously. They're not what we expected. No, Hartmann agreed. They practice what my philosophy students would call restraint as strength. It takes more courage to show mercy than to seek revenge, more wisdom to rebuild than to destroy. Greta's hands trembled as she set down her fork. How do you bear it, knowing you were wrong about everything? By choosing to be wrong about better things, Hartmann replied with a sad smile. I was wrong to believe in the inherent goodness of academic institutions, wrong to think education alone could prevent moral catastrophe, wrong to assume that following orders absolved one of moral responsibility. But I can be wrong in service of truth rather than lies, wrong in pursuit of redemption rather than destruction. Over the following weeks, the three women found themselves drawn into the strange rhythms of camp life. Anna discovered that her facility with languages made her valuable as a translator and teacher. She began conducting English lessons for younger prisoners in the evening, using salvaged textbooks donated by local churches. Her nervous energy found purpose in helping others communicate with their American guards, building bridges where she had once operated military radios. The teaching transformed her. Where once she had hunched over radio equipment, desperately trying to remain invisible, now she stood before small groups of eager students, her voice growing stronger each day. When a young prisoner struggled with English pronunciation, Anna would patiently repeat words until understanding dawned on his face. These moments of connection, so different from the impersonal transmission of military orders, began to heal something broken inside her. Ketha gravitated toward the camp library, a small building filled with donated books that American civilians had contributed for prisoner rehabilitation. Her administrative skills found new purpose in cataloging volumes, creating inventory systems, and helping illiterate prisoners learn to read. Among the donations, she discovered books by authors banned in Germany: Thomas Mann, Heinrich Heine, other voices silenced by the regime she had served. The irony was not lost on her. She who had processed lists of the condemned now processed lists of the enlightened. Her meticulous handwriting, once used to document deportations with devastating precision, now created reading schedules and book recommendations. When she opened a volume of Mann's essays, tears blurred her vision as she read words she had never been allowed to see. Greta found herself working alongside Sarah in the camp infirmary, a converted barracks that served both German prisoners and American personnel. The work was familiar yet completely different from her nursing training. Here, she administered medication to ease pain rather than withheld it to cause suffering. She cleaned wounds with gentleness instead of inflicting them with violence. Sarah watched her carefully at first, noting how Greta's hands shook when touching patients, how she flinched when anyone approached too quickly. But gradually, the American nurse began to see something else: genuine skill, careful attention to detail, and an almost desperate desire to help rather than harm. "You're good at this," Sarah observed one afternoon as Greta changed bandages on a prisoner's infected hand with practiced efficiency. "I used to be," Greta replied quietly, "before I forgot what healing meant." The words carried weight that Sarah could not fully understand, but she recognized the sound of someone trying to find their way back to themselves. In Brooklyn, her parents had spoken of Germany before the darkness fell, of neighbors who had been kind, of a culture that had produced music and poetry alongside its later horrors. Perhaps redemption was possible, even for those who had served evil. When evening came, the three women would sit together on the steps of their barracks, watching German prisoners tend to vegetable gardens they had planted with American seeds. The ordinariness of it overwhelmed them, men discussing tomato cultivation, sharing stories of home, playing chess under the supervision of guards who had begun to feel more like protectors than captors. Hope, fragile and unexpected, began to grow in soil that had seemed too poisoned to nurture anything good. 6 weeks passed like a dream that felt too good to be real. The camp had settled into routines that defied everything the women had been taught about American brutality. Morning roll call conducted with dignity rather than degradation. Work assignments that felt purposeful rather than punitive. Evening programs that nourished minds starved by years of propaganda. The first Red Cross letters arrived on a Tuesday in late May, carried by a mail truck that stirred excitement throughout the camp. Prisoners gathered in the mess hall as Colonel Patterson read names from envelopes bearing familiar handwriting. Anna's hands shook as she accepted 3 letters, each one a miracle from a family she had feared might be dead. Her mother was alive, displaced to her sister's farm near Munich but safe. Her younger brother Hans had survived the Eastern Front and was in British custody, writing from a POW camp in England. Most incredibly, her father, missing since Stalingrad, had been found in a Soviet labor camp and was slowly recovering from typhus. Anna wept openly as she read, her joy infectious among the prisoners who crowded around to share in good news. "They're all alive," she whispered to Greta and Kata. "Scattered, but alive." Kata received only 1 letter, but it transformed her completely. Her husband, Friedrich, a Wehrmacht officer she had feared was killed in the final assault on Berlin, was in American custody in France. His handwriting, still precise despite whatever hardships he had endured, spoke of hope for reunion and rebuilding. He had learned of the camp system's true nature from fellow prisoners and wrote with shame about the machinery they had both served. "He says he's proud of me for providing testimony," Keta said, her voice barely audible. "Proud that I'm helping document the truth instead of hiding it." The letters revealed the scope of Germany's collapse in ways that radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines could not capture. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Millions of people wandering as refugees. The systematic horror of the concentration camps being revealed, photograph by photograph, witness by witness, grave by grave. Yet somehow, in this American camp, hope flourished despite the devastation. Anna's English classes had grown from a handful of students to nearly 50 prisoners eager to communicate with their captors. She had discovered a gift for teaching that surprised everyone, including herself. Her nervous energy channeled into patient instruction. She helped young men write letters home in broken English, and older prisoners memorize phrases that might help them find work in the post-war world. "You're becoming a teacher," Professor Hartman observed one evening as Anna reviewed lesson plans by lamplight. "Not just of language, but of possibility." Anna blushed at the praise. I never thought I could be anything more than an operator following orders. But here, helping people understand each other, she searched for words. It feels like building instead of destroying. Keta had transformed the camp library into something approaching a small university. Her organizational skills, once used to track human cargo with devastating efficiency, now created reading programs that introduced German prisoners to literature their regime had banned. She discovered that many of the men could barely read beyond an elementary level, their education sacrificed to military training and propaganda. Working with donated books from American churches and civic organizations, she established literacy circles where older educated prisoners taught younger ones. Her favorite moment came when a 19-year-old farm boy from Bavaria successfully read his first complete poem aloud, Heinrich Heine's verses about Germany that had been forbidden for over a decade. "The books they tried to burn," she told Greta quietly, "they're more beautiful than I ever imagined." Greta's transformation was perhaps the most profound. In the infirmary working beside Sarah, she rediscovered the healing arts she had abandoned for the brutal efficiency of guard duty. Her hands, once instruments of punishment, learned gentleness again. She memorized patients' names, learned their stories, celebrated their recovery from illness and injury. Sarah watched this transformation with a mixture of professional admiration and personal conflict. Greta's medical skills were undeniable. She could start IVs on dehydrated prisoners that Sarah herself might miss, could recognize the early signs of infection or malnutrition that saved lives when treated promptly. More importantly, she showed genuine compassion for suffering that seemed to come from some deep well of remorse. "Where did you train?" Sarah asked one afternoon as they cleaned instruments together. "A village hospital near Frankfurt," Greta replied. "My supervisor said I had gentle hands, that patients trusted me." Her voice grew bitter. "I wonder what she would think of what I became." "Maybe she would think you're finding your way back to who you were meant to be," Sarah suggested carefully. Their friendship developed slowly, built on shared medical knowledge and mutual respect for each other's skills. Sarah found herself looking forward to their conversations about patient care, their debates about treatment approaches, their quiet moments of satisfaction when someone healed under their joint care. The Holocaust report she had read created a barrier she could not fully cross, but she began to see Greta as a human being capable of both terrible choices and genuine redemption. The camp itself had become something unprecedented, a community where former enemies worked together toward common goals. German prisoners staged theatrical performances for mixed audiences of POWs and American personnel. A camp newspaper printed on a donated mimeograph machine featured articles in both German and English about gardening tips, chess tournaments, and philosophical discussions led by Professor Hartmann. Religious services drew remarkable attendance. Colonel Patterson conducted Protestant services with the assistance of German lay ministers, while a Catholic chaplain from a nearby town celebrated Mass for prisoners of that faith. Jewish prisoners, few though they were among the German POWs, received visits from rabbis who came not to condemn, but to offer spiritual guidance for men struggling with their roles in a war that had nearly destroyed European Jewry. On a warm evening in June, as the three women sat on their barrack steps watching prisoners tend to flourishing vegetable gardens, Anna voiced what they all felt. "I keep expecting to wake up," she said. "This can't be real. People don't show mercy to their enemies." "These people do," Kata observed, her administrator's mind still cataloging the impossible kindnesses she witnessed daily. Greta remained silent, watching Sarah emerge from the infirmary after a long day caring for patients who included both American soldiers recovering from battlefield injuries and German prisoners dealing with the long-term effects of malnutrition and untreated wounds. The American nurse waved at her, a gesture that 6 months earlier would have been unimaginable. For the first time since childhood, Greta allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. The weight of her crimes remained, would always remain, but perhaps there was space in the world for someone who chose daily to heal rather than harm. The hope felt dangerous, fragile as spring flowers, but it was real, growing in soil that had seemed forever poisoned by war's bitter harvest. The envelope arrived on a morning that had begun like any other, carried in a canvas bag marked with official War Department seals. Colonel Patterson received it in his office, along with similar packages destined for POW camps across occupied Europe. Inside were photographs, testimonies, and documentation from newly liberated concentration camps, evidence that would be used in upcoming war crimes trials. Patterson spread the contents across his desk with the careful reverence of someone handling sacred relics. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, names that would haunt history. But it was the folder marked Ravensbrück that made his hands tremble slightly. 3 of his prisoners had served there. The photographs were worse than he had imagined. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, their eyes hollow with starvation. Mass graves filled with bodies so emaciated they barely looked human. Medical experiment victims, their wounds photographed for evidence. Guard towers overlooking barracks designed to house cattle, not people. He found Sarah in the infirmary, checking on a German prisoner recovering from pneumonia. Greta worked beside her, adjusting pillows with the gentle efficiency that had become her trademark. The sight of them collaborating over patient care made what he had to do even more difficult. "Lieutenant Cohen," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you in private." Sarah followed him to his office, leaving Greta to continue alone. When Patterson showed her the photographs, her professional composure cracked like ice under sudden heat. She had read reports, heard testimonies from liberated prisoners who had made their way to Allied medical facilities. But seeing the systematic starvation, the calculated cruelty, the sheer scale of the horror rendered in stark black and white, it transformed abstract knowledge into visceral reality. "This is Ravensbrück," Patterson said gently, "where Greta Muller served." Sarah stared at images of women prisoners, their faces gaunt with hunger, their bodies reduced to skeletal frames barely covered by rags. In one photograph, female guards stood at attention during a selection process, their well-fed faces impassive as they decided who would live and who would die. The contrast between the guards' health and the prisoners' emaciation struck her like a physical blow. "She did this," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "While I was learning to save lives, she was destroying them." "We don't know her specific role," Patterson cautioned. "But yes, she was part of this system." Sarah's hands shook as she turned through the photographs. Women her own age, mothers with children, elderly prisoners who reminded her of her grandmother, all reduced to numbers, to categories, to things rather than people. The gentle Greta, who worked beside her in the infirmary, who remembered patients' names and worried about their comfort, had once been part of this machinery of death. That afternoon, Sarah returned to the infirmary with the photographs in a manila folder. Her usual warmth had vanished, replaced by cold professional distance. She placed the folder on the supply table where Greta was organizing bandages. "I need you to look at something," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. Greta opened the folder without suspicion. The first photograph showed the entrance to Ravensbrück, the gate she had walked through each morning for 2 years. Her face went pale, but she continued turning pages with mechanical precision. Images of the barracks where she had conducted inspections, the punishment cells where she had delivered prisoners for infractions, the infirmary where she had decided which sick prisoners were worth treating and which should be left to die. When she reached the photographs of the prisoners themselves, Greta's composure finally shattered. She recognized faces, remembered names, recalled the moment she had denied each woman food or medical care or basic human dignity. The skeletal woman in photograph 17 was Ingrid, who had begged for medicine for her sick daughter. The corpse in photograph 23 was Margot, who had tried to save bread for weaker prisoners until Greta had her punished. "You did this," Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage and betrayal. "While these women starved, you were well fed. While they died, you lived comfortably. While they suffered, you enforced their suffering." "Sarah, please," Greta began, but the American nurse cut her off. Don't you dare try to explain this away. I've been working beside you, trusting you, thinking maybe—" Sarah's voice cracked. "I thought maybe you were just another victim of the war, but you weren't a victim. You were a perpetrator." The confrontation drew attention from other prisoners working in nearby areas. Word spread quickly through the camp's informal communication networks. By evening, most of the German POWs knew that 3 women among them had served in concentration camps. The reaction was swift and decisive. Anna found herself isolated during dinner, her usual table companions moving away when she sat down. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Her English students failed to appear for evening lessons, leaving her standing alone in the empty classroom with prepared materials scattered uselessly across tables. Kata faced similar rejection. Prisoners who had once sought her help finding books or writing letters now avoided the library entirely. The literacy circles she had organized disbanded without explanation. Even Professor Hartmann, who had shown nothing but kindness to everyone, struggled with how to reconcile her administrative role in the deportation process with the gentle librarian she had become. The ostracism hit Greta hardest of all. Fellow prisoners who had praised her medical skills now refused her care, preferring to suffer in silence rather than accept treatment from hands that had once dealt death. American personnel maintained professional courtesy but no longer engaged in casual conversation. The community that had embraced her transformation now rejected her completely. 3 nights after the photographs arrived, Anna found Greta standing at the edge of the camp's perimeter, staring through the fence at the darkness beyond. Her friend's face was hollow with despair, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "I dream about them," Greta whispered. "Every night. All the faces in those photographs. They ask me why I let them die, why I chose to feed myself while they starved." "Greta, don't," Anna began, recognizing the dangerous tone in her friend's voice. "I should have died with them. I should have died instead of them." Greta turned toward Anna with eyes that held no hope. "What's the point of redemption if it's built on a foundation of corpses?" Anna stayed with her through the night, talking desperately about their shared work, about the patients Greta had helped heal, about the possibility that mercy could coexist with justice. But even as dawn broke over the camp that had once seemed like paradise, both women knew that something precious had been irreparably shattered. The hope they had carefully nurtured lay in ruins, destroyed not by American brutality but by the weight of truth they could no longer deny or escape. The separate barracks for war crimes suspects felt like a tomb. 3 small rooms in a converted storage building, each containing a single cot, a wash basin, and a chair. No windows faced the main camp where German prisoners continued their daily routines of work, education, and slowly rebuilding their sense of humanity. Here, time moved differently, measured not in productive hours but in the weight of memories that refused to fade. Greta had stopped speaking entirely. She sat on her cot for hours, staring at walls painted institutional gray, her hands folded in her lap with the precision of someone who had forgotten any other posture. When guards brought meals, she ate mechanically, consuming just enough to survive. Anna tried to engage her in conversation through the thin walls, but received only silence in response. Anna herself oscillated between frantic letter writing and periods of paralysis. She wrote to her mother, her brother, anyone who might remember her as something other than a participant in Germany's machinery of war. Her handwriting grew increasingly erratic as she tried to explain the unexplainable, to justify choices that seemed beyond justification. Most letters remained unfinished, crumpled and discarded in the small wastebasket beside her chair. Keta had retreated into the administrative precision that had once served her so well. She organized her few possessions with obsessive care, folded her single change of clothes with military precision, and wrote detailed inventories of everything in her cell. When that task was complete, she began writing lists of every person whose deportation papers had crossed her desk, as if documentation could somehow balance the scales of justice. June passed into July with no word about their ultimate fate. The Nuremberg trials were beginning, but their cases were smaller, less significant in the grand scheme of accountability. They might face years of imprisonment, or they might be repatriated to a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. Sarah struggled with her own demons in the main camp infirmary. Her medical training demanded that she treat all patients with equal care, but the photographs from Ravensbrück haunted her interactions with German prisoners. When a young Wehrmacht soldier thanked her for healing his infected wound, she wondered if he had stood guard while others suffered. When an older prisoner asked about his medication schedule, she saw potential complicity in every grateful smile. Colonel Patterson found her one evening sitting alone in the infirmary, staring at empty beds that would soon fill with new patients requiring her care. "Mercy is not the absence of justice," he said quietly, settling into a chair beside her workstation. "It's what makes justice possible." "How?" Sarah's voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "How do I reconcile healing people who may have participated in genocide? How do I separate the person from their actions?" "The same way God separates the sinner from the sin," Patterson replied, "not by ignoring evil, but by believing transformation is possible even for those who seem beyond redemption." Sarah shook her head. "Some things are unforgivable." "Perhaps, but that's not for us to decide. Our job is to be faithful to our calling, whether that's healing bodies or healing souls." The conversation continued late into the night, touching on questions that had no easy answers. Eventually, Patterson asked the question that had been weighing on Sarah's heart since the photographs arrived. "What would you do differently? If you could go back, what would you change?" "I would have recognized her humanity without ignoring her crimes," Sarah said slowly. "I would have asked harder questions earlier. I would have tried to understand how someone could become both a healer and a killer." "It's not too late for those questions," Patterson observed. 3 days later, Sarah walked across the compound to the separate barracks, carrying her medical bag and a folder she had compiled over sleepless nights. Inside were not accusations, but questions, carefully constructed to help her understand the woman she had worked beside for months. She found Greta exactly as expected, sitting motionless on her cot, staring at nothing. But when Sarah entered the small cell, something shifted in Greta's posture, a slight straightening that suggested awareness despite her apparent detachment. "I need to understand," Sarah said, settling into the single chair. "Not to forgive or condemn, but to understand. How did a nurse become a guard? How did someone trained to heal learn to harm?" For long minutes, Greta remained silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "I needed work. My family was starving. The guard position paid well, included housing and food." Her words came slowly, like water seeping through a cracked dam. "They told us we were protecting Germany from enemies, that the prisoners were dangerous criminals who deserved punishment." "When did you know that wasn't true?" Greta's hands began to shake. "The first week, maybe the first day, but by then I needed the job too much to leave. And after the first month, I was too deep in to get out without consequences." "What consequences?" "They made examples of guards who showed mercy, transferred to combat units, or worse." Greta looked directly at Sarah for the first time in weeks. "I chose my survival over theirs. Every day for 2 years, I chose my comfort over their lives." Sarah felt her anger begin to transform into something more complex. Not forgiveness, but recognition of the human capacity for both moral courage and moral cowardice. She began to ask questions not as an accuser, but as someone trying to understand how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. Over the following weeks, Sarah visited regularly. Sometimes she brought medical supplies and treated Greta's minor ailments. More often, she brought questions that gradually revealed the full scope of the camp's operations. Greta's responses became a form of testimony, not offered in self-defense, but as penance. The information proved invaluable to war crimes investigators. Greta's detailed knowledge of camp procedures, guard rotations, and administrative systems helped locate survivors, identify other perpetrators, and understand the full scope of the concentration camp network. Her cooperation led investigators to mass burial sites that might otherwise have remained hidden. Anna was eventually selected for repatriation, her skills in communications needed for rebuilding Germany's infrastructure. Before leaving, she visited Greta one final time. "You saved my life that night by the fence. Anna said quietly. Maybe now you can save others by telling the truth. Kata's administrative expertise proved crucial in documenting the bureaucratic mechanisms that had enabled genocide. Her meticulous records helped convict major war criminals while distinguishing between true believers and reluctant participants. She testified at multiple trials, her precise testimony helping ensure that justice was both thorough and proportionate. Greta received a 12-year sentence which she accepted without appeal. She spent those years in a women's prison working in the medical unit and corresponding with Sarah, who had remained in Germany as part of Reconstruction medical efforts. Their letters evolved from interrogation to genuine dialogue about redemption, responsibility, and the long path back to humanity. On Christmas Day, 1957, 12 years after that first Easter feast, Sarah opened a letter postmarked from Munich. Greta's handwriting had grown steadier during her imprisonment, and her words carried hard-won wisdom. "You showed me what mercy looks like," the letter read. "Not permission to forget, but strength to face truth. I am still learning what it means to feed people instead of starving them. Every day, I try to earn that Easter feast." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer alongside dozens of others. Outside her clinic window, German children played in streets rebuilding from rubble, their laughter a testament to resilience and hope. The work of healing continued, one patient at a time, one choice at a time, one act of mercy balanced against the demands of justice. The war had ended, but the longer work of rebuilding human decency had only just begun.